Good day, Crime Talk aficionados. This is ScottReisch of Crime Talk, and today we only have one thing on the docket, and that is a special guest, Lena Derhally. She is the author of My Daddy is a Hero, How Chris Watts Went from Family Man to a Family Killer. This is a very good book. It's a great presentation of the facts, and her psychological assessment of Chris Watts is based upon psychological research and her professional experience as a licensed therapist. Mr. Derhally recognizes the Chris Watts case for the tragedy that it is and has the intent to hopefully prevent something like this happening in the future. I hope you enjoy the interview and buy the book. I'll have a link to pre-orders as well as to Mr. Derhally's website. Have a great day, but let's talk about it. Good day, Crime Talk aficionados. My name is Scott Reisch, and today we have Lena Derhally with us. She has written a new book, My Daddy is a Hero, How Chris Watts Went from Family Man to Family Killer. I had the privilege of receiving an advance copy of this book, and I will tell you, it is excellent. This story is not just a rehash of what we kind of thought we all knew about the Christopher Watts case. It is a story for people who are very familiar with the facts or someone who's never heard anything about it. Lena weaves together these facts and this story and the dialogue and really makes it presentable and quite readable, interesting. And then she goes into the psychological analysis of Chris Watts and how he got here so that we can figure out, well, how he got to where he did what he did, and can we prevent this and spot this from somebody else? So let's welcome Lena Derhally. How are you?
Thank you, Scott. I'm great. And again, I just wanted to say your endorsement of the book means the world to me, and it just is really great to hear you say that. So thank you for having me and inviting me.
Well, your publicist sent me a copy last night, and I spent the evening reading it, tabbing it, highlighting it, and it really was a good read. I kept thinking to myself, wow, she's a very good writer. And then when we got to kind of the other half of the book, which was the explaining is the various diagnoses that one could potentially have, it was very interesting. So let's talk about the book. First, when does it go on sale? Where can people get a copy of this?
So the official release date is Monday, December 9th, but it's available for pre-order on Amazon now for Kindle and paperback. So to my knowledge, if somebody were to order it on paperback today, they should receive it on the 9th. If you order it on Kindle, it will be released to you automatically on the 9th. And then it will also be available on Kindle Unlimited. So the people who subscribe to that monthly service get to read it for free.
All right. Well, I'm not receiving anything out of this, but I really did enjoy the book. It was very well written, and I'm honored and privileged to have you here to talk about it. So why don't you give us a quick biography of you and, tell us, where do you go to school? What do you do for a living?
So, yeah, I have, a BA in psychology, and I have several master's degrees, one in communications and media studies, where sort of my love of writing comes in, and one in something called pastoral counseling. I started my career working in pediatric oncology, and I also worked in adult oncology and did end-of-life care and, worked with the mentally ill and the homeless, and sort of ended up, and that's why I use this sort of holistic spiritual counseling degree, because there are all these questions that, why does suffering happen to good people? And, you don't have the answers to why a child gets cancer, for example. And so that was where my interests were. And then I'm not going to get into it, but life led me in another path, and I became an Imago certified couples therapist. So I'm licensed psychotherapist and also an Imago certified couples therapist.
Okay.
So I specialize in relationships, relational dynamics, and I focus on helping people repair relationships with a partner, a spouse, a family member. So that's sort of where my clinical focus is now. I've written a lot on parenting in the Washington Post. I used to freelance and write regularly, and a lot of my writing was about my adult clients who would come to me and they would talk about what happened to them as children. And so I would use those lessons to tell parents that, here are some good tips to raise healthy, happy, thriving children. So that's a little bit more about my writing career. And and I am a clinical faculty at George Washington Medical School, where I just mentor med students on bedside manner and just helping them go through the medical school process. So those are just a couple of the things that I'm really interested in.
Okay. And doing couples psychotherapy, that's something that obviously you get to see where the rest of the world thinks everything's okay, and it's not. Even though Facebook may think everything's fine.
Exactly.
But yet they're in for counseling because the marriage is on the rocks, which is kind of the situation which happened here. Is nobody saw everything because everything was fine. Everything looked perfect.
Right.
So I think that as you read the book, it becomes very clear that your professional experience really kind of weighs in here. It's not just a bunch of speculation. You can say, hey, I have training and experience, and this is what really happens in real life, which is what we try to do on Crime Talk, which is, here's the facts, but let me tell you how it's really done in the real world, what really happens out there.
Yeah. So. In 10 years of couples therapy, I have seen it all. And I think you may remember this part in the book where I talk about, I used to have a personal Facebook page, and, I had, 700 friends. I don't have it anymore. Don't like social media myself, but people would post all these glowing things about their partners on Facebook. And the ones that I just had to hide from my feed because they were so overly saccharine and gushy, and I was like, ugh, I just can't take it. Behind the scenes, because they knew I was a couples therapist, they would send me these messages and their marriages were on the rocks. And I just found that such a fascinating tidbit. 100% of the time, in my personal experience, that would happen. And so I just thought that was a really interesting thing. And it's a way to normalize for people too. Hey, nobody's got it together. What is put out on social media most often is an illusion or what people want you to think. And that's okay too,
Yeah, well,
I'm not telling everyone don't go air all your dirty laundry on social media either,
but you don't have to make everything look completely perfect. I mean, there's a reason why they call it fake book for nothing, right? So,
and people just all have this natural inclination to compare themselves to others. And so that's constantly what we see happening with social media. It makes people feel bad about themselves.
Well, particularly young kids, they get so depressed now because they think everyone else in the world is running off, having a perfect life, and I'm sitting at home doing homework, and they become completely depressed. And whether it's children or adults, but I think really notice that a lot in the children these days. But so let me ask you this: my daddy is a hero, and we'll get to the point. I think I know why you named it that. But why did you decide to write this book?
So I didn't really plan on publishing it. As I said, I've been doing couples work for 10 years. I've worked with a lot of people who come in because they have a family member or a partner that sort of has these narcissistic traits or personality disorder traits. And with Chris Watts, I could not find anything that made sense to me personally about the profile. Like he was the opposite. To me, he had the opposite traits of someone who would do something like this. Like I've seen you cover some of these other cases, Patrick Frazee, Fotis Doulos, I think for me, those cases don't interest me because I can kind of see these guys kind of look controlling. Fotis Doulos' wife had restraining, orders against him. So you see these patterns. But with Chris Watts, it was the exact opposite. And I was so fascinated by that. And in my practice, I usually feel like I can spot these people. And in 10 years of doing this work, there is only one man I saw that was like Chris Watts. And I think there's such an anomaly.
Yeah, it is very intriguing. I mean, like you said, you can oftentimes look at someone's criminal history, past behavior, and, past performance is indicative of future results. Oh, they've been violent. They have outbursts. You could see, I could see him hurting somebody. But as you read the book, the facts, previous interviews, everyone thought Chris Watts was just the good guy.
Yes.
Really laid back.
His own wife did. up until like the 6 weeks she went to North Carolina, there is no evidence to point to any sense of, feeling of being unsafe with him. I said in the book, I believe she trusted him implicitly, and she would have never walked into that house that night if she had thought he was capable of anything even close to this.
She wouldn't have left the children with him if she ever thought that he was capable of hurting the children anyway either.
No, never.
So what I like about your book is you're very candid. Obviously, you lay out the facts, and I think whether, like I said, you are someone who knows all the facts, you've read every page of the discovery, or you've maybe in passing heard of the Chris Watts case, you really make this a story. It's not just a rehash of the police reports. It reads very, very well, I guess is the word I'm looking for. It reads very, very nicely. But you put a lot of disclaimers and say, listen, I don't know all the answers.
I don't, yeah.
I mean, why don't you tell me what you were looking to get from this? Because it's almost like a case study in narcissists. I mean... Yeah.
I mean, I was looking to understand myself, first of all. And then when I started, I interviewed a neuroscientist, a journalist, a criminal psychologist. I did so much research on this book. You can look at the bibliography.
I was going to say the bibliography, I mean, it goes on for pages and pages.
Yeah, and I come from sort of an academic perspective where I always have to back people. Like, it's not just my opinions. I back everything that I say up with a research or something that's been done on it. And I wanted to understand. As I started to understand, I saw that so many people out there wanted to understand too. And again, the psychology of that is that's normal. We all want to know why and how this could happen, or how we can protect ourselves or prevent this from happening. And I think that's why people were so drawn to this case, because again, sort of with me, how could this have happened with someone who seemed to be, to everybody, the perfect guy? And so once I really feel like I discovered a lot of those answers. The book and everything I wrote makes a lot of sense to me. Again, I'm not God, so I don't have all the answers, but this is my contribution. And I hope that it helps people understand things more. And if it saves somebody, from going down a dark path, or helps a woman leave a bad relationship, and even if it's only one person, then I did my job.
Well, I think the book, like I said, it's very well written. You state this is not the definitive truth out there, that this is exactly everything that can be explained, but it's your opinion regarding your professional experience, what you've been able to research, what we know about Chris Watts from the police reports, the interviews.
Yeah.
I think it's very well thought out and reasoned, and it's very plausible. It's not some far-flung theory that, well, it all happened. I think you referred to at some points kind of the perfect storm, so to speak, of everything coming together. But
everything.
So let's talk about what was your theory, and talk about what you were doing. And we just briefly before we started talking, that we talked about this Goldwater Rule. What is that? And then kind of maybe explain where you went from there.
Yeah. So the Goldwater Rule is that it's actually with the American Psychiatry Association. That's really what it majorly applies to. And I'm not a psychiatrist. I'm not a medical doctor. But just in general, it's that we're not allowed to diagnose people that we haven't met, which is a very good thing. I don't think it's a good thing to diagnose people that we haven't met. However, there's sort of this clause, and you may have remembered from the Tarasov case, where it's basically duty to warn, that we can break this rule or law if we feel that we warn somebody from imminent danger. And there's also duty to inform, which is what I actually kind of use more so than duty to warn. I mean, Chris Watts is in prison, but duty to inform is this, this is to me the public service announcement. So people can understand. One of the things that, one of the reasons I really wanted to put this book out there is because people think just because somebody doesn't have a history of killing small animals or, having criminal behavior or warning signs, that they're not capable of this. And that's not true at all. And so I really wanted to educate people that, psychopathic, well, I'm going to say traits, because again, I can't 100% say he's any of these things, but my theory is someone, with psychopathic traits or narcissistic traits. And if you recall in the book, I talk about a subtype of narcissism that hasn't been talked about yet, as far as I know, in regards to Chris Watts. And that these narcissistic, psychopathic people, they don't look like what people think they look like. And that's why, another thing I wanted to tell people about that.
Well, and let's talk about that. I mean, we've talked, you hear a lot of times, somebody's a psychopath, a sociopath. He's narcissistic. Why don't you explain what those are and kind of what the elements are required to give somebody a proposed diagnosis?
Yeah, and I think you had mentioned that you liked in the book that I sort of do this in-depth breakdown of what those are. And the DSM, which is, the psychology Bible, which is what we use to diagnose people. And personally, I'm not a huge fan of diagnosis to begin with, but it does help make sense of behavior for people. And there's a lot of argument in the psychology world about the difference between psychopath and sociopath. They're pretty similar. Some people will say a psychopath is born where a sociopath is made. But what I really wanted to focus on is this term community psychopaths from my book. And that to me was actually a new revelation, learning about a community psychopath. So whereas I think the traditional psychopath, the Robert Hare checklist, right, is that you sort of have this history of truancy or, criminal behavior, just disregard for the law, but that's not necessarily the full definition of a psychopath, or it doesn't encompass all the psychopaths, which is why I went towards, hey, what's a community psychopath? This is a different type.
Well, again, let's talk about this communal or community psychopath, and how does that fit into these anti-personality disorders? I mean, is that kind of a big grouping for psychopath, sociopath?
Right.
That's the official diagnosis, right, under the DSM?
Right, yeah, and a lot of these aren't in the DSM. So the only thing really in the DSM is something called antisocial personality disorder, which has to be diagnosed 18 or older, which is, a lot of these traits, psychopathy, sociopathy, I can never even say it, sociopaths, right, and antisocial personality disorder, the thread with all of them is a complete lack of empathy, disregard for another person. And so, but antisocial personality disorder is what we have in the DSM. Now, underneath antisocial personality disorder is conduct disorder, which is, that's if you're 18 and younger, and that's when you're sort of showing those signs of maybe you start you fire, arson, or you torture a small animal. That could be signs of conduct disorder. And I think that's, again, what people are thinking of when they think of a psychopath. But a psychopath and sociopath are sort of under the umbrella of those terms. There's a great book, The Sociopath Next Door, that's out there that a lot of people are familiar with. That sort of just talks about these people that just don't care about other people. They manipulate, they're ruthless. Their agenda is themselves. They can engage in criminal behavior, but they also may not. And so community psychopath, would you like me to get into that a little bit?
Yeah, let's talk about that. What is a community psychopath?
Yeah, so they're living among us. And, I interviewed Dr. Kim Gorgans. She's a criminal psychologist, and she sort of shed the light for me on this, is that she said the only psychopaths we study are incarcerated. And so there's so many out there that we just don't know about, but a lot of them, or most of psychopaths, are nonviolent and will never go to prison. And she called Chris Watts a failed psychopath. And I have that as a chapter in my book, or a subheading, the failed psychopath. She said, because he's not very good at it, because he's in prison.
Yeah, he's terrible at it.
She's like, but there's lots of psychopaths out there who are very good at it and never go to prison. And sometimes maybe they have done horrible things, but they're not in prison. And she says, psychopathy, it confers to a lot of advantages in fields like politics, So there's a lot of speculation that many CEOs and politicians may have psychopathic traits. But she said, she really had me understand that many, many psychopaths are nonviolent and they never even think about killing anybody. And that's sort of the community psychopath, is they're in your community. And I had found in my research that there's several people who are willing to come out as self-described psychopaths. And there was this one woman in particular in the book, and I wrote about this article she wrote. She's a female self-described psychopath, the nonviolent one. And she describes her experience of being a psychopath in the world. And when I read it, I was like, this sounds exactly like Chris Watts.
Well, why don't you expand upon that? What did she say in that article? I know you mentioned it in the book. But...
Yeah, so she senses from a very young age she's different from other people, and she calls, people like you and me, Scott, people, normal people with a normal span of human emotions. She calls us neurotypicals. So, she thinks of herself as someone who's just not neurologically typical. And she says from a very young age, she knows she's different from other people. She does not experience human emotion or feelings. And as she got older, her parents became very concerned because there was, a big family crisis. And she had no emotion about it. So that's when they sent her to therapy. And through therapy, she was able to find out that she was a psychopath. And it made her feel better because she had an explanation for feeling different for so long. And she was sort of doing this public awareness that, hey, as psychopaths, we're all stigmatized, but we're not all, we're not what you think we are. We don't. And then she also, what I was thinking about was, there's the story about Chris Watts' dad who had the drug problem. And how Chris, in one of his confessions, says it just never really, it didn't affect him. And so I thought about her. The family crisis didn't affect her. So that's one example. Another example, which I just think is, one of the hearts of the book, is the mimicking. And how this woman, the self-described psychopath, describes how you learn to mimic from a very young age, and how the mimicking gets so good by the time you're an adult that it's almost better than a real person because it's so perfectly crafted. And so, in the book too, I point to a lot of examples where I see Chris doing the mimicking. And I think in many cases, he was mimicking Shanann.
Why don't you explain that further under this communal narcissistic inventory list of, how these people think that, like I said, I'm a great guy. I'm the most caring person around, most caring person I know. I greatly enrich everybody else's lives that are there. I'm just a really good, understanding person. And how that kind of comes together. And is this something like a nature versus nurture type of thing?
Yeah, so we'll start with the whole communal narcissist thing. I know that people following the case have, they talk a lot about covert narcissism. And again, when we think of narcissism in general, or a narcissistic personality disorder, which is, something like 1% of the population, it's quite extreme. But we have to think of narcissism on a spectrum. And that spectrum is, some people are really high on it, some people are low. And someone in some research in the book, I say you kind of want to be moderate, because you need a moderate sense of narcissism to do things in the world, like your show. But it becomes unhealthy when it becomes extreme. And at the extreme end of all narcissism, whether it's communal, covert, or, malignant, is that there's a lack of empathy, there's exploitation and entitlement. But a lot of the times it can be very, very hidden. Now, with covert narcissists, a lot of the time they're hiding it from the rest of the world, but behind closed doors with their own partner, they can be quite emotionally abusive or abusive in other ways. I know I was actually... full disclosure, I was in a relationship with one, thank God, briefly, but, to the outside world, going to church, building homes for the poor, and then behind closed doors, the Jekyll and Hyde. But Chris wasn't like that.
Well, yeah, everybody kind of...
No. And that's what I think threw me off, too, because there was absolutely no evidence. Shanann said it herself when she was having a text message with her friend Addie. We have never had problems like this. This is so out of left field, By all accounts, Chris was deferential to her. He was submissive. He was hands-on with the girls. So he didn't fit that profile to me. So when I started researching communal narcissism, which is a relatively new subtype of narcissism, it's been around for about 10 years. And there is research on it. It's, it's not some hokey kind of thing that
not just something you're just making up here.
Yeah, you can go find journal articles on it and everything, and real studies on this type of thing. But it's referred to as the wolf in sheep's clothing. And the communal narcissist is the good person. They are the presidents of the PTA. They are the church leaders. They're the nice guy. They do good things for other people, and they pride themselves on it. And I think Chris really enjoyed being the good guy and really prided himself on that. And that's where he got, what they call narcissistic supply from, by doing good deeds to other people. And you can see, too, in the book, I sort of talk about how he may have developed into that throughout his life.
Can you explain what you refer to in the book as triple E?
Yeah, that's the the empathy, the lack of empathy, the entitlement, and exploitation. So again, all of those are the 3 hallmarks of narcissism. And that was coined by Dr. Craig Malkin. He's a leading expert on narcissism, and he's got a lot of great books for anyone who's looking to read more up on that. He does a lot on communal narcissism as well.
Well, talk about the exploitation. How does that fit in with Chris Watts?
Well, I don't think that's the thing too. I don't think he was overtly showing a lot of this stuff. I think maybe the empathy impairments were always there. It's just people were mistaking him for being for being quiet when he actually just didn't have any emotion. So I think that was kind of always there. The exploitation, I mean, he was exploiting people left and right, when he started his affair with Nikki Kessinger, as far as we know,
How about entitlement? Did this guy feel entitled? I mean, it's not like he was, having, Shanann wait on him hand and foot. And he was, he didn't overtly say, I'm special, come treat me differently, did he? I mean,
right. No, and I think that's, the communal narcissism thing is that or covert narcissism even, is they can think that they're special and nobody will know it either. And so he could have thought in his head, and I think we see this now in prison when you see, like, I have Sherilyn Cadle's some of that stuff in my book as well. You see in prison how he's talking. He is very entitled. He believes he's entitled to get out of prison. He believes he's entitled for everybody to forgive him. He was entitled to think that he could murder his family because they were in the way of getting what he wanted. That is the peak of entitlement.
And even kind of, coming back to the good guy, his lawyers are saying, hey, we'll go forward with, doing it. But no, I'm going to plead guilty. I'm just going to, get this behind me. Because once again, he's trying to look like the good guy. Yeah, I've done some bad things, but I'm still the good guy.
Yeah. And Sherilyn Cadle said that that's really important to him. And that's, this book that she did is he's really trying to convince people still that he's the good guy.
Yeah.
Hey, I'm confessing. I'm absolved of my sins. Let's, everybody forgive me now. And I think that's the huge part of his identity is feeling liked and special. And when he doesn't have that, there's like this emptiness for him. That's how he gets his fuel.
What's the origins of narcissism? I mean, is this something that, your parents did to you? Is it a gene somewhere? What is it?
Yeah, the theory, again, and these aren't necessarily hard sciences, when you think about personality disorders, but there's several theories on how one becomes a narcissist. One is the obvious, which is, overvaluing the child and making them feel like they're the best person on earth. But sometimes with that, there's a little bit of a danger, because just because a parent overvalues a child doesn't mean they're receiving, and I talk about this in the book as well, parental warmth, which is the feeling that they're unconditionally accepted and loved. And so, the child learns that they are only special if they're really good at a sport or really good at school, and the parent really focuses on that part of them, and then the child sort of splits off, and focuses on that part. But I think the more popular theories are the ones where the child, may not be getting attention in childhood, or, it could be parental neglect. It can be extreme, like neglect or abuse, or it could be just kind of not noticed. And at that point, the need to feel special, they put up these defenses where they block themselves off from feeling hurt, from either not feeling wanted or not feeling special. And then they give themselves that feeling. And so, that it's this sort of, they always say the narcissist is deeply insecure inside, but it's just a construct to make themselves feel better. But it's so in place that they don't even often know that they're insecure or self-loathing.
I never used to think much about this, but as you get older in life, you start realizing you start doing things either because your parents did it that way, or you're doing something completely opposite of what your parents, because they did it. And I think we're all broken, flawed individuals. And I think a lot of it comes back to childhood, and you think, oh, that never happens. But when you really look at people's issues, at least from what I have to deal with on a daily basis, a lot of it comes back to your parents. How did they treat you or not treat you in a particular way? Do you think this communal narcissism of Chris Watts. I mean, did it come from his parents?
Well, I really tried to be compassionate about that because I don't know them very well. I really didn't want to say, and I think I do say a lot in the book. I looked at research where a lot of stuff is how we are born, and environment plays a role for sure. But I always give the example of you kind of know who you are from a very young age. I'm pretty extroverted. I've always been. My brother's the opposite of me. He's always been that way. In a way, he's more introverted and prefers more quiet time. So we have these personality traits that have been set in place. I've always been a huge empath. It informed my career path, and it's been since I was very young. I always wanted to take home all the animals that I found on the street. So I think, we come into the world pretty wired, and then the environment shapes us. And, I think I say in the book, I don't know if it was Chris's perception of his childhood or what actually happened in childhood that may have at least contributed. And that being said, I don't blame his parents at all for any of this. But I did want to take a look at that and see, without blaming them, to see.
Yeah, and I think you made that very clear. I think you stated in your book the only person who has any blame here is Chris Watts. Because obviously you haven't interviewed these people, you haven't talked to him, and he's ultimately the one that did whatever. So we can't. I'm not, and I don't want to make it sound like we're blaming his parents or we're blaming Shanann and her parents or anything along those lines. But I do think it's interesting how people come about and who they are, and a lot of it comes from your interaction as a young person. So I'm just curious what your thoughts were about him and his childhood and the way his parents treated him in this, this impaired empathy and remorse and pathological lying, impulsivity, everything that kind of led to here's a guy who, for lack of a better term, never really been in trouble, just went along, get along, and one day he's having an affair, and next thing you know, he's killing his wife and children. I mean, how does that come about?
Think that was the perfect storm that I talked about. There's, as so many factors. I go into attachment theory, imago relationship theory. I interviewed a neuroscientist. I interviewed a criminal psychologist. I looked at diagnosis. I looked at upbringing. I looked at, so many different things. And I think it all came to a perfect storm where, he was always that way. But as Kim Gorgon said, he became a failed psychopath. He could have lived his life as a psychopath and nobody would have ever known it. And again, it feels like a stigmatizing term in a way, because there are plenty of nonviolent psychopaths who are afraid to come out and say, hey, I identify as such, because people don't want to be around them. So, I think that it was the perfect storm of stuff that brought out things that were already in him, that he was always capable of it, but he needed this perfect storm of events to trigger it all.
And maybe you can explain this. It's brought up in your book, and we hear about it when you go through the life of Shanann Watts. Is that when she meets Chris Watts, she's not really interested at first.
Nope.
But then he appears to be this really good guy, and he's going to doctor's appointments with her, and he
went overboard.
He kind of went overboard for her, and what's to say he just really cared for her and was going to be the best boyfriend he could be at the time, versus saying, oh my gosh, warning signs, this guy's a psychopath.
And again, maybe he did. I can't say 100% what's in his heart and what's in his mind. This is, again, just what I know from my professional expertise. But again, in some of my research, I found out psychopaths do think that they feel love. I do believe Chris believed he loved his family, and, but it's just because they think that doesn't mean that it's true. There's an article I referenced in the book called How to Be in a Relationship with a Psychopath. There's really so much out there about this type of thing. And so, maybe he thought he loved them in his way, but we know he didn't know what love is, as I say in the book, because everybody's talked about this extensively, his Google searches. I'm sorry, but people don't Google, what do you feel when someone says, I love you? And meanwhile, he's constantly telling his wife he loves her. And I cite all that in the book, and I give those examples, and I might put my opinion in there. Hey, here's a point where he said this, but so
Well, and that's what I like about your book is that you have your theory. Here's kind of the psychological rules or diagram. I'm sorry, the psychological outline of what you're looking for, and then you back it up with the facts to say this is why I think, it is what it is.
And I always tell people, and I tell my clients this too, I don't really, I don't give advice as a therapist. I don't try to tell people what to do. People reading this book, if it makes sense to you, then great. If it doesn't, you don't have to believe it either. I'm not offended either way. So, but it's just, again, my contribution. If it helps people in any way, then that was what my work was for this book.
Let's talk about a narcissist in a romantic relationship. I think this is something that really, if you want to help somebody, this is kind of really is out there. Explain this love bombing and the steps of how that comes about.
Yeah, so I believe anyone who's been in a relationship with a narcissistic person, and there's a lot of us, you look on, Instagram, there's narcissist recovery groups, like hundreds of thousands of people in them. And so some people would refer to it as a public health crisis, but even Chris followed the pattern of a narcissist in a relationship. He just followed it in a little bit of a different timeline. So, the love bombing, which is what you alluded to earlier, when he first met Shanann and she didn't want him, and he knew that, he really stepped up his game. And even though she said at one point he has no game, she didn't believe he was having an affair, or it didn't make sense to her because she felt he had no game. But he did have game because he won her over. So, he stepped up his game. He went with her to a colonoscopy. Her mother, there was that time where she was lying on his lap and she fell asleep and he had to pee and he let her sleep there for 3 hours, and she called her mom, and her mom said, he was sent to you from God. Like, he really knew what to do. He let her feel like she could be like herself, He just he went above and beyond. I think one part in the book, I talk about how he put out their Thrive vitamins in the morning and left notes on that, like love notes for Shanann and Bella and Cece. And he was just over the top, and that's what we call love bombing. And that is always a sign, again, that something's not right. Again, we are conditioned by romantic comedies to think that, and it could be someone being really nice, but I always have a little suspicion when someone's doing a little bit too much because they're trying too hard to win you over. That's always a little bit of a red flag. Not 100% of the time, but just something to be aware of. And so then, they feel like when they've usually on a, traditional path of the narcissist in a relationship, when they start to feel more comfortable, they let what they call the mask slip. And that's when they enter what's called the devalue phase. And that's when, I call it Jekyll and Hyde. And in the narcissistic relationship that I was in, it was shocking because he felt, the love bombing. Oh my gosh, I don't know what I'll do if I don't see you again. Very over the top romantic gestures. And then when comfortable, it was like being on eggshells. I didn't know when he was going to berate me or say something awful about me, and then he would pretend nothing was wrong after that. It's like nothing ever happened. Call me, hey, how are you? And so that's kind of a devalue, right? Is that they make you feel like crap. And, usually the longer you're in the relationship, the dark side is more prominent than the good side. So why do we stay in these relationships? Because they still give us the glimmer of the good. However, arguably, this didn't happen with Chris Watts until he really started getting hot and heavy with Nikki Kessinger, as evidenced from the text messages between him and Shanann. For a while in the beginning, when she first went to North Carolina, he was really, and I, point this out in the book as well, he's really playing along. He's saying, I love you, boo, I'm sorry, And, but she knows, she has a gut feeling something's wrong. And then he really starts to enter this devalue phase. And it's just absolutely heartbreaking. I think I told you, Scott, before we started the interview, when I wrote this, to make it, a really good piece of writing, I really put myself in the position of each person. So when I was putting myself as the empath in Shanann's shoes, and I even get choked up thinking about it now, just looking at this selfie of her that she sent to her friend after she had been crying for a week because it was just so awful to imagine being pregnant with your third child and the anxiety she must have felt, and it just so shocking. And the rug was literally ripped out from under her. And I think in the book I say, once you start feeling devalued, I strongly urge people, try to, that's not a good sign, ever.
It's the relationship. I mean, I guess it could come back around, right? But there's usually something going on, for sure. I mean, Chris Watts, I mean, like he asks, what does a murderer look like? And I guess you could say, oh, there's a person that's, homeless on the street and he looks, beat up and ragged, and you think, oh, maybe he's got mental health issues, something along those lines. Sounds like people that you've worked with. But they may not harm anybody. And then you have Chris Watts, who looks relatively normal. What does a murderer look like, and how can somebody go from Mr. Good Guy, maybe not perfect in every way, particularly if we look back, armchair quarterback kind of thing, but we look back and say, how did we miss this? I mean, was there something that we should have seen, that Shanann should have seen?
Yeah, and I always say that I don't really think there was anything anyone could have seen or done. As far as I can see, I don't think from what I have seen and what I know, I don't think anybody knew that he was capable of this. Again, I know other people might disagree with me on that, and that's okay. That I understand why they do disagree, but just for my personal opinion, I really think that nobody could have done anything to prevent this. Although sometimes I often say, like, Shanann was here today, I wonder what she would say in hindsight. Like if she,
had she,
because hindsight's 20/20. Like almost like Chris's mom, she would say, the only thing I can say is that he was really quiet as a child. And she always wanted to know what he was feeling. And that was the theme of the book, is that nobody ever knew Chris. Even the friends, you look at the friends that are talking about him, like, everybody said he never showed emotion, like every single person interviewed.
That was very memorable moments in the book where people would say exactly what he said. We never really knew what he was thinking. He never really showed emotion. It was kind of just, he just kind of went along with what everybody else was doing.
Right. And that was the mimicking part. And I listened to every interview with every coworker. Again, heartbreaking, some of them. And, it almost feels like, again, everybody was duped. And so also in the book, I interview a journalist who wrote a book called Duped, and she was duped as well. And she's got a lot of great insight on how easy it is to be duped and how good dupers are and how good they are at it. And so, and I don't even know if Chris was consciously duping people. I was talking to my mom about the book recently, and she was like, I don't even know if Chris knew he was capable of this. And I kind of agree with her. I don't even know if he did.
I don't think we'll ever know. I mean, obviously, we've seen the polygraph interview. We've seen his statement standing outside his house. We've seen or listened to the interviews of him in jail with, the CBI, FBI, and the local detective, and then his letters as well. And, I think that what he says, there's enough to corroborate in the evidence that says this is what happened, but I'm not even sure he really knows where the truth is.
And as a self-described psychopath that I talk about in my book, she's like, we don't even think we're a psychopath. Like, that's not, and he doesn't. I don't believe he thinks he's a bad person. I don't think he thinks he's a psychopath. I don't think he thinks any of that about himself. And I'm not sure if he knew what he was capable of until the weeks before when he started planning. And maybe he only decided to fully go through with it. He may have been, again, in some of my research in the article, psychopaths, what's a hallmark of them is with these crimes, they plan in advance. That's when that's what I've been told. That's when it's a psychopath. They plan these things in advance. I don't know if he thought he would fully go through with it, but we know, again, from what he said in Sherilyn Cadle's book, that he was planning this weeks in advance. And in the book, as you know, I talk about the evidence to back that up.
You do, and I think it's very plausible. We've talked about this on Crime Talk, several times. Okay, this is what the prosecution is alleging. If I was the defense counsel, what would I say? Oh, maybe it was a heat of passion. It wasn't really planned. But I think it's very clear in your book that there was some premeditation there as it relates to the killing of Shanann, going to the tank battery, the communications with his coworkers.
Right.
And obviously there's premeditation when you have, two children in the back of your truck and their feet are dangling over their mother who's dead on the floor, and you're driving there and you could stop any time you wanted to. And I've driven that route. There's hospitals, there's gas stations. There's so many ways that he could have stopped to do it. I mean, did he have this break from reality, or is this just the personality of a narcissist that I'm going to go kill these people and now I get on with the next phase of my life?
And that's where we're going to the neuroscientist, right?
Yes.
So that's why I have a great neuroscientist I interviewed for this book. He's so smart. Dr. Doug Fields. He wrote a book called Why We Snap, and he was so generous. He gave me a very long interview. He's become a friend, and he's done research on what he calls a break from reality. And I talk about, he's allowed me to use, parts of his book and some of the articles he's written because, I wanted to understand myself. What does it mean to snap? And when I interviewed Dr. Fields, this was before, Cato's book came out recently. So I have been writing this, this manuscript for a while. And I, it was just, it was just shocking, the information, but it backed up what I thought. I always thought it was premeditated. And so there we have it. So it kind of threw a curveball in the book a little bit, because I was like, okay, so now it's premeditated. People aren't going to think that he snapped, because everyone's vision of what snapping is that you get into this rage, right? You're so angry and you don't even know what you're doing. It's in a snap second. And I think that there is, that is true. But Dr. Fields has a very different definition of snapping, and he calls that a break from reality, which is you're not psychotic. You don't have psychosis. And I can say I did, in my career, I have worked with someone who had murdered 4 people and got off on the insanity defense. And I know that it's super rare. But he was psychotic when he killed them. It was a drug-induced psychotic episode. He was hallucinating. And so, and I've worked, with schizophrenics and things. I know a psychotic episode. Chris Watts did not have a psychotic episode. He was standing on the porch, he was not out of his mind. Everything was methodical and planned. And so for myself, I said, okay, yeah, he didn't snap. But when I talked to Dr. Fields, I think Dr. Fields has a very different opinion than me on that. So I don't know if you want me to get into that.
Yeah, why don't you? Why don't you get into it? I mean, I think it's, I think it's interesting, and like I said, this snap portion is like all these stressors that are somehow coming upon you, or and you just go and do it. But it's not like you're, walking by and you're having a bad day and you kick the dog, so to speak. I mean, this is killing your wife and children.
Right, yeah, and Dr. Fields, his research is, studies on brains, and it's animal brains, but his study has shown that there are 9 neural pathways in the brain that will trigger a rage response. And so, for example, they would shoot electrodes into this part of the hypothalamus of a mouse's brain, and then, or an animal, that animal would immediately go into attack mode and kill another animal. It was just that instant. And so he discovered in his research 9 things that will trigger a rage response, which I talk about in the book. But when I asked him, hey, can a rage response go on for longer than minutes? And he told me that you can have a break from reality for days, weeks, or even months. But all this to say, he's been asked to testify and, criminal trials all the time with this, and he won't do it. He said, ultimately, the person is accountable. This is not an excuse. This is more of a way to understand how people come to this point. And so, that break from reality, I think in a lot of ways, Chris did have a break from reality in the delusional sense that he thought he could get away with this and that this was a good option,
Well, do you think that notion that he could get away with it, given the interview to the reporters, talking, to the police, basically thinking, hey, I'm a good guy. Everyone's going to believe me what I say because no one's ever really questioned me before. Mm-hmm. It kind of goes back to that narcissistic thing. If I can get away with this.
Yeah. And I think that was part of it too. And that's, that is a real hallmark of a narcissist. They really believe they're charming you. And I've had a bunch in my practice, they really think they have charmed me. And, we always say in couples therapy, a narcissist will only go to couples therapy when they're at rock bottom, or they think that they can convince the therapist that their partner's the problem. They want to bring the partner in and say, oh, see, the therapist agrees with me. You are the problem. It's not me. It's part of their, emotional.
Never my fault. I'm always the good guy here.
Yeah, and they can be really good actors. And like I said, usually I can spot them even when they're really good actors. And there was one time that in my entire 10-year career of doing this, that somebody was like Chris Watson, totally shocked me with their duplicitous life that I came to find out about later. So
you said you wrote this.
They do exist. The nice guys who are nice to the world, but they do exist, but they're rare.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to sound like a narcissist, like, hey, I'm a good guy. But, obviously I have been divorced, and I probably wasn't the best husband. I focused on my, building a law practice and career and whatever. And now, you meet somebody, it's like, well, I can do this a little better this time.
Yeah.
I have the resources. I don't have to work 18 hours a day every day.
Yeah.
Would you like to go out?
Yeah.
So I'm not saying, but I like to think that there are still a few good guys out there, because it seems like so many times in my practice I see these nice ladies coming to help out the complete loser. Who doesn't have a job, who just can't get a job, but she's working 3 and taking care of the kids, and he's in trouble. And I just think, God, why can't she go find a nice guy?
Yeah. And I do believe, even, doing this case and everything, I do believe most people in the world are good people. And I see that every day in my practice. My clients are amazing people. They give me faith in the world. A lot of them have been through really severe trauma, horrible things. Yeah. And they are just the most resilient, empathic people. And, I think Tennessee Williams had a good quote that there are no good or bad people. We kind of all fall in this spectrum, but we have a blindness and a misunderstanding to what's going on in someone else's heart. And as a therapist, you never know the whole story, And so I try really hard not to judge other people and I try really hard to take a positive outlook on the world and humanity. And if not for myself, for my kids,
Understand. Now, you said you wrote this book so that, if you can help some person, maybe get out of a bad relationship, or prevent something bad happening to them physically or emotionally. Can you tell if you're being duped? I mean, what are the signs, if any?
Yeah, there's good news and bad news, right? So sometimes no. And I think the scary part of all of this for people is, we're human and we desperately want to believe that we would be able to spot this type of thing, but it's not always the case. And I think this is a clear case of when that happened. But yes, I think 9 times out of 10, if you have the right skill set and you're educated and you're aware, you can spot a duper. You can start to look for those signs. And hopefully my book has pointed out at least some of those signs that people can look for, even the subtle ones.
Yeah. And maybe you can ask, I mean, obviously, Chris Watts was not the first person in the world to ever have an affair. But most of these, people that have an affairs, whether they stay in the marriage or get a divorce, the majority of them are not going out and killing their wives and children when they get home.
No.
That's rare, and I think that's one of the things that makes this case so intriguing.
Especially the killing the children is so rare. And are you a parent, Scott?
I am. I have 2 kids,
yeah. Okay,
25 and 23.
Oh, good. Congratulations. You got them out of the house, I hope.
My son is an officer in the Air Force. He's a pilot, and my daughter is in a graduate program working to be a nurse practitioner. So
that's great. So you should be very proud.
Just about done. They still have time to mess it up.
Yeah, and I talk about this in the book, too, with the comment Chris makes about going through the grocery store looking for his kids and not feeling anything. But, as a parent, the second you lose sight of your child in a playground, that immediate panic goes. But just as any parent knows, and the vast majority of parents believe this, the absolute worst nightmare is something happening to your child, right?
Absolutely.
It's the worst thing you can possibly think of. Nobody recovers from that. Again, my time in pediatric oncology, I have seen parents lose their children. That is not something you ever wish on anybody. It is the worst thing. So the idea of somebody going against the parental instinct to not only protect your child, but to want to die for your child if you had to, it's just so foreign to most of us. And I think that in itself shows the extreme pathology that he was able to do that. That's very extreme. Or, you know, some criminal psychologists would say malignant narcissism, very extreme psychopathy.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I would love to talk to the guy because, you know, I've met lots of people over my career, and I would love to just sit there across the table and see what makes this guy think.
Yeah.
You know, does he think he's smarter than everybody else? Does he, you know, I'm just a good guy? I mean, he actually thinks he's going to get out on good behavior. I mean,
I know. And that's what's worked for him his whole life, being the good boy. He was always the good boy. Like I said, from early childhood on, he did everything, and it served him. It served that purpose for him. It got him what he wanted, and he can't do that anymore, but he's still trying.
Yeah, he needs to come to the realization that it is over. He is never getting out of prison. It's just not a question of if he's going to die in prison, but which one will it be? So it's, I mean, he like I said, I'd still like to talk with the guy. I think it'd be interesting to just see what makes him think and get my own perspective, just based upon the people that I've represented over the years that have, you know, committed homicides and things like that, and being able to talk to them, you know, particularly with strangulation. And I've talked about this I've represented clients that have strangled, been accused and convicted of killing people. And, you know, strangulation is such a personal thing. I mean, there's so much rage that has to come with it. It's not like I shot somebody, it was an accident. You know, somebody can pass out after, you know, seconds of having, you know, pressure put around your throat, but to actually kill them, we're talking several minutes of actually applying and staring at them and looking at them and watch the life leave their body. And so, you know, it's just interesting. He can be very nonchalant about it. Like, well, it happened, but, you know, I'm still a good guy.
Yeah. And I think, again, I hope the book sort of explains how that could be possible for him to do that and still believe that he's a good guy. Yeah.
Well, I really enjoyed reading your book. Thank you for sending me an advance copy. I thought it was well written. The science of it, so to speak, is there to back it up in your theory. I don't think you're going on any extreme, you know, theories that there was, you know, like 5 other people in the house or anything like that.
Yeah.
This is trying to explain why Chris Watts did what he did. We know he did it, but the question's always been what made him do it. And I think you have a very good analysis in your book.
I'm not an investigator, so that's not. So I'm not an investigator, so I can't say. All I can talk about is what I know about, which is psychology. So if people are interested in the psychology of stuff like this, then this would be a good read for them.
Okay. Well, I am going to recommend, and I get nothing out of this other than I get to speak with you today, which has been an absolute pleasure. I would recommend to everybody go and purchase My Daddy is a Hero. And I think I forgot to ask this. Why did you name it My Daddy is a Hero?
Well, it sort of goes along with everything we've been talking about. Obviously, everybody knows that the viral video with Bella singing My Daddy is a Hero. And again, I actually had a bunch of titles, and everybody that I ran the titles by, that was the one that they picked. And I think it was just this really chilling image of somebody who was a hero, you know, but he ended up being the opposite of what they thought. And that's what this book is about, is that, you know, people can be the opposite of what you think they are. And sometimes you're not going to know. And can you know? Are there subtle signs? And again, I hope that this book has shed some light on some people to look for some of those signs and to not be so easily fooled. Just because someone acts nice doesn't mean they are nice. And so that's another thing I wanted to tell people, because it makes me nervous to see people can be easily duped just because somebody says nice things or does nice things. And again, that's where we go back to the communal narcissist, that, they can do that. They can be the nicest person in the room, but they're doing it with an agenda.
Yeah. Well, I enjoyed the book. I highly recommend everybody out there who sees this video to get your book. We will put a link so that they can get the pre-orders. And I thought it was well written, and I wish you the best of luck on the book. It was great. I really appreciate you taking the time to speak with me today.
I just wanted to add one more thing, that I did want to do something to honor Shanann, Bella, Cece, and Nico for this book. And I had watched Shanann's mother, Sandy, on Dr. Phil, and she had designated 3 charities that she wanted people to donate to. And one of them was St. Jude's. And so for every book bought in the pre-sale in the first week of sales, I will donate $1 to St. Jude's in memory of my time in pediatric oncology, in memory of Shanann, Bella, Cece, and Nico, and for a close family member of mine who is diagnosed with a rare form of leukemia. And I will post receipts on my website because I want to confirm that I actually did that. So so people know that I'm true to my word.
Okay,
but
great. Well,
I do want to put that out there.
Why don't you put a quick plug onto your website? I'm assuming they can get the book on your website as well.
Yeah.
Why? Do you want to give that?
It's LenaDerhally.com. Sorry, LenaDerhally.com. So
okay,
there'll be all
great.
the information.
Well, that's.
Thank you so
I mean,
much,
that's.
Scott.
I appreciate it.
Talk about this.
I appreciate you taking the time. I really did enjoy the book. It's very nice that you're donating money. Obviously, you don't have to do anything like that, but the fact that you're doing that, I think, it's a very nice gesture. So.
Oh yeah, I didn't write this for money, and I more likely will lose money because I had to spend a lot of money to put a really nice book out there that was vetted by a great attorney and a great editor and a great designer. And so I could give something so people could, read something that was worth it. I put a lot of money and time and resources and energy into it. So it's definitely not about money. So, and I don't care about money.
Well,
so.
and I like I said, I read it all. And it's very clear that you spend a lot of time on this book. Just the way it reads, I think it's very well written. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Scott. Thanks again.
All right. Have a great day. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.